my actual computer in front of me today. So if you are over on YouTube, I'm not going to constantly be checking. I'm trying to do a couple of other things while we do this live. That distract kind of helps my brain, and it also helps me not do comments. There's a lot that distract does for me. So today we're going to discuss cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. We've talked in the last couple of lives about different things that we find globally that aren't quite cultural appropriation. They're more, in fact, something that somebody else already had in their ancestry. We've talked about tattoos and we've talked about hairstyles and how far back many of those go. Oh, there it is. But it has been touched on in both of those lives what the actual difference is between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation, and what those differences mean, and how they affect us. Again, I'm doing other things while we do this because it helps me to not only focus, but it also helps me to ignore things that I should be ignoring. So when we look at appropriation versus appreciation, these things are really important, especially in today's world where we're trying to make sure that we're honoring everybody and we're trying to ensure that we're doing things in positive for others, understanding that by doing things in positive for others, we're creating positivity for ourselves. Reciprocity and community are huge things. Community is based on reciprocity, and without reciprocity, you're not going to find the ability for you to have the things that you want to have. It's really important that we look at things like reciprocity moving forward, because our lack of reciprocity in culture has gotten us here. The takeover of Western thought, which is based on exploitation and not reciprocity, really gives us a culture and a sense of self that is not healthy for us. Hello, everybody coming in. And that lack of sense of community has left us with the feelings that we have, the depression, just those, the fact that it's just so hard for so many of us these days. So I think that when we're looking at those things, I'm going to go ahead and share this to some people. I'm going to ask that everybody that can or wants to do the same. For some reason, since I downloaded the YouTube or the TikTok live studio, that doesn't. Since I downloaded the TikTok live studio, I'm no longer being seen very well on here. So I want to make sure that we are getting people to actually be able to see in here, and that things are going out on people's pages and things like that. I'm not sure what it is that's done it, but it seems like our numbers stay very low. Not that, it's really about getting out to, not that it's about the numbers themselves, but it's more about the number of people reached. So when we're looking at things like reciprocity, we have to understand that give and take that is healthy for human community is one of those things that we're mentally missing, that's causing some of that mental heartache that we have, right? And also is how we move forward. So when we talk about things like why is appropriation bad, one of the huge things and reasons why appropriation is bad is the fact that when we're appropriating from somebody else, we're not engaging in reciprocity, we're engaging in exploitation and greed, right? So as long as you're engaging in an exploitative, greed-based thought process, economy, lifestyle, then you're not actually, moving us out of the kind of tragedy that we're in right now, right? The kind of end times, or whatever it is that you want to call it. And to move us forward as a species, it's really healthy to understand our past and understand where we've come from, and also to understand where those things that used to benefit us have been lost and how we can gain them again, right? And when we're looking at reciprocity, when we're looking at that give and take, it's very, very, and very important that we take that give and take and, use it as kind of a foundation, right? Because when we live in exploitation, everybody's miserable, even the people at the top. right? So giving back to that, or getting back to that give and take, getting back to that reciprocity puts us in a better space, right? Puts us in a better thought process as a species moving forward. And it also gives us the ability to move forward in a healthy way so that we can get past this thought process, not past this thought process, past this apocalyptic thing that we're in, like right past this, climate destruction that we're really in, past kind of killing ourselves, because that's kind of what we're doing, is killing ourselves, right? So, and people are like, well, that's just liberal thinking, or that's just this thinking, or you're people try and make compassion and empathy a negative. In trying to make compassion and empathy a negative, they're doing that so that they can maintain their power, right? And they're doing that because they don't have the ability to have those things. And so if they can make it a negative for you to have those things, yet by definition, compassion and empathy are positive things. By definition, exploitation is a negative. In any definition that you're going to read of these words, in any understanding, compassion and empathy create a healthy species whole, whereas exploitation digs away, picks away the beautiful things about our species until there's nothing left. So exploitation degrades the species as a whole by the definitions of what they are. Compassion and empathy are understanding another human being, seeing what they're going through, feeling for them, wanting to ensure that they have a good world, right? Because we understand that they are us and we are them, right? Whereas exploitation is seeing another human being and seeing what you can take from them until you rob them of everything and they are no longer a capable human being or able human being, right? And then we act as if the resulting husk of a human being is somehow the human being's fault instead of our fault for constantly mining away and stealing and exploiting what is positive about them, right? So this is where we get people who are houseless, and we have decided that houseless people are somehow negative or wrong instead of people who are um, in need of compassion and empathy because they've been exploited until there's nothing left to give, right? So when we're looking at those things, these are really simple reasons for using. I'm going to really quick turn myself on airplane mode just to kind of make sure we don't get any phone calls in. Um, that didn't quite work yesterday. So when we look at that, we can understand why exploiting somebody is a negative, why exploitation in and of itself is a negative, right? And in understanding why exploitation in and of itself is a negative, we can understand why appropriation is a negative. If we can understand that it's inappropriate to look at another human being as something that can be exploited until it's no longer, functional and feasible, as long as we get our own out of it, then we can see that appropriation is a part of that exploitation of that human being until there's nothing else we can get out of them, right? So if you've exploited a lot of everything else, you're going to exploit this as its last portion, right? You're going to take what is left, and if what is left is culture, if what is left is understanding, if one of what is left is, you know, examples or historical figures or things like that, uh, then you're going to take that because it's what's left, and you're going to exploit the last whatever, right? So, when we're looking at why appropriation is wrong and how to get people to understand that appropriation is wrong, I find that the easiest way to get people to understand something when they're desperate to not, right? The groups of people who have decided it's their way or the highway is to use their own real and their own logic against them, right? So, if we say, it's important to have compassion for children, isn't it? Like, would you say that it's important to have compassion for children? Would you say that it's important, therefore, to have compassion for other people to ensure that other people are healthy? Do you see that this is a compassionate action versus an exploitative action? Do you think it's okay to exploit people? Because most of the time you're looking at people who fundamentally agree. And I say most of the time because not always, not everybody fundamentally agrees on some things, right? And nothing's a monolith about our species. It's one of the beautiful things about our species. But you're looking at most of the time people who fundamentally agree with you on the idea that, we should be taking care of each other, right? I know, right? I love this picture. Uh, and so if they fundamentally agree and you can get them to understand through a different perspective, you're going to find that that fundamental agreement on a different perspective is going to maybe get them to understand something that they wouldn't have, right? So if you can show them that their argument is the same, like that they're arguing for something that's very similar, right? Ew, yuck. Um, but I think for me, that's where I try the most to try and see how others might see things, and then try and talk to that to get people to understand. So, like, say, take the Second Amendment. I am an absolute supporter of the Second Amendment. Uh, I do believe that a well-organized and well-regulated militia is very important to protecting our country and protecting ourselves. And that gives us the right to be a well regulated militia and have arms. So, when you look at the Second Amendment in full, the Second Amendment in full says that everybody should be trained in guns. Everybody should have a class in high school that teaches you how to shoot, to take care of, and when not to, right? Like how to ensure your trigger control, right? A class in high school that's well regulated, right? So when we're looking at those different things, we can see that fundamentally, I agree that we should all have guns, and fundamentally, you agree that the Second Amendment is right. And pretty much everybody is going to tell you, yeah, I really want my children or myself to take a class, right? And that is the full of the Second Amendment. So, and I can say that Republicans or the alt right or people on the other side really do want their children to take classes on how to work a gun, because one of the arguments for a lack of gun control is that there is a given by Republicans that I found through Republican channels through being married to somebody who went alt right, is that when there's a town in the Midwest that's right next to a prison, and it's the safest town in the United States. The reason it's the safest town in the United States is because they have a high school mandatory class. Everybody in high school has to take a gun safety class and has to learn how to shoot, has to learn how to care for their gun, and has to learn trigger control. And so everybody in this town walks around carrying guns, right? Well regulated militia, right? And Republicans absolutely want to be part of a militia, right? So if you look at the Second Amendment at whole, it suits both sides. It fits both arguments that we see. We just have to look at it as a whole instead of picking and choosing the things that we want to actually decide that we're playing with, right? See what we're going to ignore for this and see what we're going to ignore for that, which is just an example of how you can show people that really really we're all just trying to get by, really we're all just struggling through, really it is the government that's killing all of us, and most of us believe that. Like 99% believe that the 1% is out to kill us, right? So if 99% believe that the 1% is out to kill us, if you showed them that there's not two sides to the 1%, that there's not a good versus evil at the top, but that it is in fact evil, right? I'm not sure I like evil as the terminology, but still, right? That it is the top that in itself is the problem. If you show them that, Republicans agree, Democrats agree. They both believe the government's the fault, right? So when you unsavory, yeah, but it's more than unsavory to me. So I don't believe that evil exists as an innate being within us. And I don't believe that there's an omnipotent evil or an outside evil. But I do believe that humanity or human beings can be evil. I have met plenty of evil human beings in my life, right? So I do believe evil exists. I just don't believe it exists as Satan. I don't believe it exists as some form of a deity. And I don't believe it's an innate quality. But I do see and have experienced and, understand that evil does exist, right? It's just not your innate way of being. Your innate way of being is communal and nurturing. And the evil that exists is because somebody has robbed us of that innate way of being, right? In my belief, in my thought process on it. So when we're looking at why appropriation is bad, we can see this. We can see that when you're looking at it as, we're supposed to be in a reciprocity, in an exchange of love, to create the community that we want to create. If we are looking to get back to a communal thought process in a process that creates within us the ability to survive basically in a healthier way, if that is what we are trying to do, then it is very easy to see that comes from and only comes from taking care of each other. That's not something that you can get from just taking care of yourself and ignoring everybody else. And when we get to the fact that you cannot have your own rights without ensuring that everybody else's rights are upheld, right? That your own rights can't be taken away from you, neither can anybody else's, which means you can't take away somebody else's rights, right? If nobody can take away your rights, you can't remove somebody else's rights. If you expect other people to uphold your rights, then you have to uphold theirs, right? That's a two-way street. It cannot just be a singular way street. So, or it just doesn't happen, right? Let's logically think of who the fuck is going to uphold your right to anything if you are not upholding other people's rights. Who's going to uphold your right if you haven't upholded anybody else's right? You think they're going to come in and decide that you're somehow specialer, you're somehow better? There's some reason that they should uphold your right, though you have no reason to uphold their right. There's just no way that it works like that. There's no way that anybody's logical brain can tell them that people are going to take care of them if they aren't doing it in return, that they're that special. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, there are plenty of narcissists out there. There are plenty of people out there, that are part of a dark triad or the dark triad who, are incapable of seeing themselves as anything other than the be all and end all, and nobody else actually matters. So there are plenty of people out there who think with that and see that logic. The thing is, though, is that if you think with that and you see that logic, then you're most likely part of that top level that's trying to, screw everybody else over. More about what appreciation versus appropriation is today, Fantasia, just because of the fact that through the last couple lives that we've talked about with archaeology and looked at different hairstyles across the globe and different tattooing across the globe and things like that. I want to make sure the question has risen a couple of times, and I've tried to make sure that I've cleared it up, but also to meet it throughout the life. I still want to make sure that people understand what is the difference between appropriation and appreciation, and what is it that why appropriating and not appropriating, why they're a thing and why they matter, why it matters not to appropriate, and why appreciation matters. Because I want to ensure that as we're moving forward, that it's a broader understanding for everybody of why. Of course, many of us already know why, but it's also sometimes hard, and this is the one that came up over the last couple of days, is it's very hard to explain to some people why it's not okay to appropriate, why you shouldn't appropriate culture. And so I want to try and give some ideas of explanation of why. And remind that, as we're talking from people who we might view as being on the other side or something along those lines, please understand that I don't view myself as a Democrat and I don't view myself as a Republican. I don't view myself as any of those things, too far left for anything in the US. And I'm personally, excuse me, I call myself a rightist, as in stop taking them away, because I believe in rights. But like I was stating, I believe in the Second Amendment in its entirety, which states that, your well-regulated militia is important, which means a class in high school for everybody. Then if you decide you want to own a gun, you've already had the class and you show the ticket that you've had the class, right? And so now you have the ability, because a lot of states you don't have to have a class to get a gun, maybe to get a hunting license, but not to get a gun, right? So um, if we can show somebody who might be, because there are two sides to this, right? The Second Amendment in the United States, currently, there are two sides. There are the don't take my guns, and I agree. And there are um, well regulated. They call it they're trying to make more laws. And I half agree. I do believe that we should have some regulation in process because that's what the Second Amendment says. I do believe that we have no regulation in process and that it's supposed to be regulated. So I do believe that we need some regulation, as the Second Amendment says, which is, well, I believe we need regulation because well regulated is what the Second Amendment says. So if I am looking to either side, I can explain that, yes, we should have some form of a law. We should have some form of classes for everybody in high school. You must have a class in high school, and you have to prove that you've had that class in high school to be able to get a gun, right? Because even most don't take my guns will tell you that it's important for people to have classes to understand how to care for their gun, how to shoot their gun, and what trigger control is, how and when, right? So we can both agree, if we frame it in that vocabulary, if we frame it in the keep the Second Amendment exactly how it is, enact the first half of the Second Amendment, stop ignoring it, right? And the first half doesn't mean I come in and I catalog your guns. The first half means everybody's well trained. That's what a well regulated militia is, right? So when we look at this, we have to understand that we can use the logic that we all have, like the vocabulary, the vernaculars, and everything else that we all have that are very important to us, to really give us this idea of what we are supposed to be doing, and what we need to, um, not what we need to, but how we can understand each other in a level that we need to get to a point where we are no longer sitting here intentionally causing harm to each other, because we can understand that empathy is positive for everybody if we actually look at the base words of them. And so I've gone over that a couple of times. I just want to make sure everybody knows it. But I'm going to start into what is cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. One example that I really like usually is earrings. So if you look at indigenous cultures, pretty much in the US, you will see that beaded earrings is a very prevalent thing. And there's a specific design or a specific inspiration, a lot of times is what it's referred to or called. And when you're looking at that, you're going to see that you'll find a lot of people out there who are selling indigenous inspired, or they'll frequently call it native inspired jewelry, who have no roots to Native American culture. Now, when you look at this, you're talking about people who actually have like other ways that they can bead. Beads are global, they're universal. We see our oldest ones in like ostrich shells, I believe, in South Africa, from Homo erectus. And we actually see that, not Homo erectus, from early Homo sapiens, but we see actually beads among Neanderthal. We see beads among many other humans. So we actually see that beads is really kind of this universal thing that we get a whole lot of anyways, right? So you can absolutely have beads without having can absolutely have beads without it being indigenous inspired or Native American inspired beadwork, right? And if you can have beads without it being Native American inspired beadwork, why aren't you using non-Native American inspired beadwork? Why are you calling it Native American inspired, right? So when we're looking at um, wearing indigenous inspired or indigenous beadwork, the best thing to do, or let me rephrase this. There's nothing wrong with you buying. In fact, it's extremely supportive to buy Native American beadwork from Native American creators, indigenous beadwork from indigenous creators. I have lots myself. I also create, though I don't sell because for me it makes it harder for me to do. But like this is a pair from Makwa, who is a indigenous person in coastal Salish territory, but I believe that she's Micmac. They are Micmac. I can't remember for certain. And they do a lot of artwork that they create and they sell or they give away. And I really enjoy their artwork. So, wearing artwork that was created by Indigenous people is a appreciation of culture because you're wearing beautiful things that you're appreciating, right? You're enjoying them. B, you are helping indigenous people actually, move forward, actually a lot of times feed their family, a lot of times take care of their community as well. And so this is cultural appreciation. There's nothing wrong with you wearing indigenous uh, things, right? Like, so somebody sends you a ribbon skirt, somebody sells you some jewelry. There's nothing wrong with wearing these different indigenous things. There is absolutely something wrong if somebody teaches you how to make your own ribbon skirt. You take a class with them, and you learn, or somebody makes you a ribbon skirt, and you take a look at it, and you go, "Well, I can sew one of those on my own," and you start selling ribbon skirts when you are not Turtle Island Indigenous, right? Or part of the culture that comes from. And the reason that this is appropriation versus appreciation is because you are financially benefiting from a culture that you do not belong to. When somebody belongs to a culture and that culture is marginalized, and maybe things like that are some of the only ways that they can actually feed their children, because I know a lot of people that actually this is one of the methods in which they're able to actually feed their children is by creating things and selling it at different shows or selling it online. And when you are not one of those people, but you're taking the things that are special to those people, that have meaning to those people, and you're selling it to others, then you are benefiting, profiting off of Indigenous people. So there's nothing wrong with wearing Indigenous items as long as you have bought that Indigenous item from an Indigenous person. So wear all the earrings, ribbon skirts, things like that you want. A lot of people will associate ribbon skirt with ceremony. Some people do not. I know I wear mine, which was given to me by a fellow frontliner, because I wear it in the front line unless I'm like in Portland. I wouldn't wear it on the front line because, well, I'd wear it a few times depending on the day, but I wasn't about to have it completely and utterly trashed either. So there's nothing wrong with you wearing a ribbon skirt that's been given to you, or a ribbon skirt that somebody has been selling that you bought. Um, a lot of times, though, it's fancy dress, right? It's dress up dress. So you don't want to wear that, say, um, outside, really, or not outside, but like, if I'm going to go dig in the dirt, I'm probably not going to put on my ribbon skirt. So it's also important with items that you understand some of the cultural intent and impact behind them, so that you can understand why they might be more appropriate in some spaces and why they might be less appropriate in some spaces, right? It's also appropriate or important that you understand the culture behind them in a lot of things like a lot of earrings will be representative of certain things that are in work right now, like are certain things that are important to Indigenous community right now. Like I I personally have red dress earrings that I have made and given away. Um, and so I make and give away to siblings, right? Um, so you would want to make sure that you're not wearing it that you're understanding why you have it on so that people coming up to you, you can understand and say what, right? So like if I have somebody compliment me on my red dress earrings, which I made my own because I needed red dress earrings for representation. Like I wanted to get out there and speak. And when you do that, you're wearing your earrings and somebody says, "Oh, those are really beautiful earrings." And you're like, "Thank you. They're for MMIW. MMIW is missing and murdered Indigenous women." I had a sister who was a victim of MMIW last year, right? Like it's no longer with us because of it. So for me, it's important, right? And so I'm going to explain, that there's 26% per capita of Indigenous women go missing, right? I don't live in a community, unfortunately. I live in Portland, Oregon. I live in a city because I have to. Um, but so when you're doing that, you want to make sure that you are understanding the impact or the reasoning behind certain things, right? Certain things are about uh, why we wear them, right? Uh, so that's another important reason why it's important to buy Indigenous things from Indigenous artists, from Indigenous people. Because if you were to, say, go buy a pair of red dress earrings from a white woman who's beating and selling them on Etsy, you're not going to be able to explain the reasoning behind it. You're not going to be able to understand the reasoning behind it and what it means within the community, right? So again, this is where we look at that appropriation versus appreciation really coming into play, not just uh, with how you buy from others and how you interact with others, but the effects on the community and the effects on the people around you, right? So if you think, well, this is Itsy and I don't know if I can find somebody who's Indigenous, so it doesn't matter if I'm buying these earrings from this person, it affects the community, right? And so when we're looking at those reasons why cultural appropriation or what cultural appropriation is and why it's important, those are very huge things. Cultural appropriation is very much when you are taking somebody else's culture and you are profiting from it, using it for a platform, making it yourself and as if it was yours, right? Like as if because you don't understand the weight behind it, right? um, in appreciation, buying things from people who make them and or not make them, sorry, buying things from the people of that community and understanding why and then using it in an appropriate manner is important. So I buy things from primary communities. I have I was showing yesterday, but they're in the other room, a pair of beautiful peacock slippers that are from India, bought them from an India creator who was selling them online that I found. Um, and I love wearing them. I bought them for an outfit for Halloween because I went as Hera, and going as Hera, I decked out as much peacocky stuff as I could. But I love wearing them. They're such a comfortable shoe. I love, being in them all the time. I do not have to, wear them with full Indian garb for me to be appreciating them. Where it would become appropriation versus appreciation is if I was mocking Indian culture with them, right? Using them to mock Indian culture, wearing them in a way that is inappropriate for the reasoning behind them, for the inappropriate use of them, right? So, say I have something that's ceremony related, and I am using it for something non-ceremony related, then I am using it inappropriately. So travels over into that appropriation thing, even if I bought it from an Indigenous person. Maybe even more so if I bought it from an Indigenous person who told me what it meant for ceremony or showed me how to, do ceremony with this. And I ignored that thought process and instead decided that I was going to use it in a way that was not ceremonial. Or say using a headdress, a Plains Nation headdress, a war bonnet, and using it as a mascot's dress, right? This is definitely not honoring anybody. This is mocking, and this is appropriation, right? So when we're looking at that, it's really important that we understand that even if we go into something uh, and start it right, we have to carry that right through, right? Recently, there has been an issue with somebody who is a refugee here in Canada, who is going to a bunch of Indigenous ceremonies to, as he seems to kind of put it, hunt aunties and see if he can catch himself an auntie who is receiving a lot of jewelry or regalia, who went to a powwow, and so many of the things that he did at the powwow were very inappropriate, and he's building a platform off of this, right? This is really an appropriation because he is taking the uh, gifts and the knowledge that he's being given and building a platform off of those things, and not helping uplift Indigenous voices within it. And he's also very much mocking it, right? I don't have community for a lot of other reasons. Portland is a part of it, but most of my community is up north, and I also have some severe mental illnesses. So trying to get out is very hard for me. I also have. I've always been an outsider. I've always danced backwards. I've never fit anywhere. A lot of that, I think, as I'm entering my 40s and have been diagnosed, or not entering my 40s, entering my mids, and have been diagnosed, I think that is part of the ADHD. But I also know that I've just never really belonged in a lot of community because I'm just so mixed. I'm just so much of so many different things that to me, I've never narrowed them down to one. Like I just incorporate all of them. And so, uh, while I have longed to belong over time, it's never actually been something. And I mean, I'm very open and honest about that. I know where I grew up and I know who my ancestors are, but I also don't belong to anybody. I'm not claimed by anybody. So, uh, not argument, discussion on Facebook the other day about that. But when you're looking at uh, things like this person who's coming in and using that as a platform, using that as a mockery, right? There are ways that it could have been handled way differently that would have been less of a appropriation, less of a problem within community. If, say, going to a powwow, first of all, talking about hunting aunties is just disgusting on so many levels. But say going to a powwow, instead of, kind of, oh my God, the hotness, or, just glossing over the dancers and regalia and everything, if he was instead, or talking about them as costumes and stuff, and if he was instead like, look at this is really gorgeous. This is, what they're doing. Hey, what's this, and explaining a little bit about it. Well, not explaining himself, but letting other people explain a little bit about it to people. This would have been a really good way to uplift Indigenous voices and make it a much better space for everybody, right? Really give the community, right? If there's a video where this person was given sage and he took a bite out of it. Now, I don't know if he was given sage because he asked for it. I don't know if the person didn't teach him what it was intended for, and that's why he took a bite out of it. I don't know those things. I would state that if he is walking along and he sees it and he's like, "Oh, I really want that," and he tries to talk somebody into giving it to him, then it's very inappropriate to try and talk marginalized groups who don't have a whole lot out of the shit that they do have. So that in and of itself would be a very inappropriate response or behavior. Uh, and then taking a bite out of it on top of it, right? So that in itself would be extremely inappropriate. If he went up and was discussing with the person, the discussion, shifted into what this was and what the purpose was for. And the person said, I would love to gift you some so that you can use it, explaining to them that, really white sage is something that is supposed to be gifted like sweetgrass. These are not things that you're supposed to buy. They're things that you're supposed to receive as gifts for them to be correct ceremonial purpose, right? Uh, and then the boy took a bite out of it. That's still really problematic in my mind, right? Uh, if somebody gave it to him and didn't tell him what it was, that's a little bit more on the person giving it, right? Without telling him. At the same point, asking would have been appropriate, right? Well, what do I do with it then? I don't know what this is. What do I do with it? Right? Thank you for the gift. I don't know what this is. What do I do with it? So this is where we see that line crossed from appreciation to appropriation. To appropriately appreciate this, what should have been done was look what I got. I was told that this is used for ceremony. I'm not going to tell you how, but I was told that this is used for this and to use it to, keep myself safe, and I really value this Indigenous person over here gave this to me, right? Usually, Indigenous people, when we grab, or not grab, but when we get Indigenous jewelry or Indigenous items, we'll give like a shout out, which is another thing that this person didn't do. He didn't give a shout out when he was receiving gifts from Indigenous people. And that is really kind of, I mean, it's not like like how dare you not, but it's more of an appropriate and a manner, right? Because at that point, when we give shout outs, it is that it helps people. It gives people more people coming to grab their stuff, or it gives people other avenues of artistic endeavors, right? And that is really important in communities where we are very much dealing with a lack of ability to feed and care for financially, due to the way the government imposes the regulations and restrictions that the government imposes that it's not supposed to be imposing due to sovereignty, right? So um, it's very important when we're looking at that we understand that those things are important for this specific group. So if we are utilizing something from this specific group, it's important that in our recognition of that understanding, that we treat that specific group appropriately, that we treat that specific group with the kindness and compassion that they're giving to us. We treat them reciprocally. We reciprocate that love. Now, when we're looking at other items and other things, it's also important to recognize that just because something is global, you have to take the tone of the room as well. So, as we were talking yesterday, the earliest examples that I know of braiding somebody else's hair into your hair is actually ancient Rome. We see examples of braiding your hair into different shapes and different things, as well as examples of dreadlocking your hair pretty much across the globe. We absolutely see both of these things in Western Eurasia, in artwork, and even in archaeological finds at times. And in understanding these things, as well as understanding that, uh, that migration pattern also means that many spaces and the way that evolution works and the way that we have adapted to the spaces that we are in means that many of these spaces actually start out looking different than they are today. And so some of these things are, just kind of natural. And some of those things that we think of aren't natural are actually natural for everybody, anyways, as we were discussing a lot of this stuff yesterday. But as we were discussing yesterday, even if braiding other people's hair into your hair is something that can be traced back to the Romans as its earliest evidence that I know of, you should understand that in certain spaces, wearing box braids would be seen as a sign of hate. So a specific state was brought up the other day, and I'm not sure if it's statewide in that space, but the idea that the the hate groups are going to see that and think that you're one of them, right? Uh, might make you, well, should make you pause, should make you go, oh, well, shit, that's where we're crossing a line. That's where we're taking something that's, not appropriation or appreciation, but used to cause hate, and we're doubling down on it. The symbol of the swastika is actually both an ancient Nordic symbol for a god and the sun, and an ancient Indian symbol for a god and the sun. Yet, most people would hesitate to wear that today because it has been very, very heavily associated with a specific hate group, right? And most people today don't want to associate with that hate group unless they're associating with that hate group, right? So, where these things might not be cultural appropriation or appreciation, we can also see that if certain groups of us are participating in them, that would be seen as us giving hate, and therefore there's reason to not. So, reading the room, understanding what's going on in the space that you are in is very important with understanding cultural appropriation, cultural appreciation, and the mattering and the where and why, right? That's beautiful, Paisley. I love language courses. I know a lot of groups that are actually doing their best to maintain or revitalize language. I think that to me is an extremely important thing. I think being able to talk to your ancestors in their language is extremely important, and something that so many people have not been able to do, or are, have been struggling to be able to maintain the doing of. And I think that those things are vital to a continuation of culture and understanding. So when we're looking at the, way that we're moving forward, it's important that whether or not you view something as cultural appropriation, whether or not something is cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation, it matters whether or not you use it sometimes, right? So the person that was in here the other day or yesterday was stating, in my space, wearing this style of hair would make everybody believe that I was part of, the hate groups in the area. And so therefore I'm not going to do it. So basically, I believe it was wearing box braids would make everybody with my skin tone would make everybody believe, and they weren't even white, they were indigenous. But my skin tone would make everybody believe that I am actually participating in this hate group. And so they would not wear box braids, even if we understand that braiding other people's hair into your hair is really pretty far back, right? And really is way more universal than we want to think of it as from the start of it. When we're looking at that, it's an important factor. You don't want to be a part of the hate that is being sent out. If we're trying to understand these differences, if we're trying to move forward, we don't want to be a part of that hate. And that's usually a pretty simple understanding, too, for a lot of people. If you're struggling to figure out how to explain to people why things are inappropriate, we're trying to create change, and you know, we don't want to be a part of the hate. And if we're not trying to be a part of the hate and we're trying to create change, we're going to do our best to ensure that our actions are not perceived as hate. Um, I was talking yesterday as well, like I myself, you know, I do not identify myself as a white American, a white person. I have European ancestry as well, but I identify myself as globally mixed and indigenous because I'm pretty globally mixed. And indigeneity is what I was raised in. And I have those connections as well. When I deal with or go into, like, I've been invited into BIPOC spaces, and I believe myself and know myself to be indigenous, and I know my and believe my, ancestors to be, not only mixed, but I know that my direct maternal line ends in slavery here in the United States with a black ancestress who was from the Sudan. I know these things. Like, I've gotten proof of these things, and I identify as, right. Yet this space looks white. And BIPOC spaces are safe spaces for people of color. I'm not a person of color. I'm an indigenous person, a black ancestry, but I'm not a person of color. So I won't take this white face into a BIPOC space, even when I've been invited into BIPOC spaces, because of the fact that the reason BIPOC only spaces are created is to create a safe space to not feel like there's people judging, not feel like there's people that are going to attack, not feel like there's people that don't see, right? And if I walk into that space, the people that invited me there, the people that know me, know who I am, know that, I'm not white, yet everybody else is going to feel unsafe. I will create attention in the room, and therefore I would not enter that room, or even being invited will not enter, have not entered rooms like that. When we're looking at what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in these things like appropriation, things like that enter into play. It's reading the room. It's understanding that, well, I absolutely, way more comfortable with people of color than I have ever been with, lighter skinned people or white people. I don't believe I've ever belonged to white culture anyways. It's not like I've ever really, had the opportunity to or wanted to. And, it's not like I grew up within it. But I also understand that nobody is going to see that on my skin. That no matter what I do or how I come across, nobody is going to see my history on my skin. And to ensure that I am not the reason that unsafe space is created, the reason that unsafe space or unsafe feeling is created, I would not do that. And that is about that wanting to ensure that I'm taking care of community above taking care of myself. It's not about taking care of self when you're dealing with community. Now, don't get me wrong. We have a really bad problem with self care in our society, and self care is extremely important. Yet, it's also extremely important to make sure that your needs are met and that other people's needs are met. You should not put other people's desires before your needs, but you should put other people's needs on the same level as your needs. Again, that reciprocity, that having to have a two-way street with it. You can't expect somebody to uphold your rights if you're not upholding other people's rights. Yeah, and that's real, Paisley. My dad is literally a dark brown indigenous man, and my skin being white is unacceptable to some. Thank you, Leah. I completely agree with you, but I'm happy to hear the indigenous experience in your voice. I appreciate that. And it does. It happens in a lot of cultures. And, like we were talking yesterday, you can perceive box braids as being only belonging to Black people. And therefore, if somebody puts box braids in my hair, which has happened, you could perceive that I'm appropriating culture without knowing that it was a Black sister of mine who put box braids in my hair because she was uh, working on her beauty school license. Like, she was doing her beauty school stuff, and she was wanting to practice. And she's like, "Can I do your hair?" And I said, "Yeah." So you can see me walking around box braids and decide that I'm appropriating culture because you see that my skin looks white without knowing that it was a Black woman who put those in my hair to help her and further her, and that I have a Black ancestor, right? That my line ends in Blackness, right? So when we look at people and we decide what's appropriating and what's not, that's the other thing that we need to look at, is that we should understand that it is not our space to really decide who else is appropriating a culture unless we are, unless we're asking questions, right? Unless we've actually asked some pertinent questions first, right? So, say we're looking at buying native jewelry, right? Indigenous jewelry. And I'm specifying native because indigenous is a global thing. And because here in the US, a lot of times they'll say native inspired instead of indigenous inspired, right? So, first of all, if something says indigenous inspired or native inspired, run, because it's obviously not by indigenous people. But if you are out there looking to buy earrings and you see this really gorgeous pair of earrings and you're trying to decide, is this person who did this artwork indigenous or not? You ask, hey, is this an indigenous owned company? Oh, okay, perfect. So I'm so glad you're indigenous owned. I'd love to buy these from you. You're not? Oh, I'd love to buy these earrings. They're beautiful, but I can't buy indigenous jewelry from a non-indigenous person because that's you appropriating culture and benefiting from it, right? So you can do a couple of little questions, right? You can find out a little bit deeper before you accuse somebody of something that you don't know, uh, which is something that we have a problem with a lot of space right now, especially online. Uh, Again, with the box braids, the pattern of the box braids, that square pattern, that itself, I believe, is specific. But braiding other people's hair into your hair is not a specific thing, right? So when you're looking at these things come into play and become important when we're trying to build community, when we're trying to ensure that everybody is healthy and safe so that we can go forward in a positive way that is going to ensure our global species health, right? Trying to make sure I got these all right. I can barely see with my glasses on anymore. Give me just 2 seconds while I try and go over these without my glasses on in the light. Okay, I think I want to do a couple more on that one. So I find these things pretty important when we're looking at that. That's pretty much the examples I have of appropriation versus appreciation. I probably have more that I just haven't handed out because I am distracted a little bit and because I get easily forgetful. So I want to go ahead and allow for questions for a little bit because I haven't really been paying attention, even though I've gotten a couple things. Whoa, 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 whoa. They renamed your reservations colonies. That is a real fucking twist of wordplay, ain't that? I would be like, excuse me, bitch. No, you are the colonies. Like that's a real funky ass twist of wordplay right there. Like that's like using words to totally reframe the situation, ain't it? Like that's really what that is. That's totally using words to reframe the situation. And kind of make it as if, like the indigenous people aren't the indigenous people there. That's pretty interesting. I'm wondering where you're at now. I'm like, well, let me get in on that shit. We need to have some conversations with some people. What the fuck? Like, that's pretty interesting. I don't understand that one. That's like making literal figurative. Like we've totally fucked up some of that word stuff. We tend to do that, but that's pretty interesting. And that's real big, Leah. Leah said, as somebody with mixed Afro-Indigenous children, it's been a journey helping them represent themselves without overstepping my boundaries. I think that that's pretty real. Well, and I know that there's some of the spaces that I grew up in, you could not participate in things like ceremony if you were under half, like if you were, if you weren't full. And that became very problematic. Like I I had a partner whose siblings were half siblings, and because their mother was white, they couldn't participate in things, and that can be very hard. Uh, so, I mean, that's absolutely well, and that's the other thing that I really want to touch on. We're seeing a lot of this coming across lately, and actually, I'm probably going to do like just a video of it. But there is a lot of conversation of Afro-Indigenous people being, or a lot of instances of Afro-Indigenous people being accused of not being Indigenous, but of being completely African and erasing indigeneity. So the whole wannabe Aboriginal thought process. And I know quite a few people who are Afro-Indigenous who are getting a lot of that hate, right? A lot of that problem coming over because there are, of course, groups that are, creating a problem, uh, you know, which is honestly something, I mean, I think a lot of lighter skin Indigenous people can understand as well, though these are definitely two different levels of issue. Um, because, for a lot of lighter skin individuals, pretendian has been a word that has been, thrown around to people who aren't even. I mean, it's definitely an issue and definitely a problem that we have, just like stating that, just like the wannabe Aboriginal thought process, definitely issue and a problem that we're having within community. It is still, traumatic and problematic to the people who are, really not pretending like there's no, or people who believe and are doing everything they can within their power to ensure that they're upholding, that in the best of ways, or, just different ways. It's really harmful to community as a whole to have that argument really going on right now. Uh, and for me, I mean, I see so much validity in uh, that Afro-Indigenous space, right? And being not just one, but two marginalized groups, and having, those two marginalized groups kind of like both of them, either one, find your space, right? So like, um, belonging to multiple marginalized groups, but being light of skin can be a little bit easier because you can sometimes slip into the that armor, right? You can slip into that white space if you want to, or if you are that type of person. Whereas being Afro-Indigenous, you can't slip into a safe space. You can't slip into a privileged space, right? Not, there's not a privileged space to slip into, right? And that's really, very problematic to me. Uh, like I said, I have a lot of people that I care about, or that, are other creators on here, or people I've known who are Afro-Indigenous, who that they get both sides, right? And it's like they're getting both sides of the hate. They're not even getting, one side of the hate, and one side is at least semi-positive. They're getting both sides of the hate. And that's completely problematic and traumatic. I would hope that we can find a way to move forward with that, and to understand that that's not what somebody means when they say Afro-Indigenous, which is going to be actually what the video I'm going to do is going to be on, is what the actual meaning of Afro-Indigenous is, which, like everybody else, at times in my life, I had to learn what things mean. And so trying to explain it to people is, part of the process. I had somebody explain it to me, and I get to explain to somebody else, or maybe hopefully multiple somebody else's. But that is very hard. Like, and for me, and everybody does this differently, but for me, I believe it doesn't matter what your quantum is, that you are Indigenous if you are Indigenous. Like, if you have an ancestor who is Indigenous and you are working to connect to your ancestry. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have connection to a North American Indigenous community to be Indigenous to North America. There are many people who are from south of the border who don't have a connection to Indigenous community in North America, don't have a nation that they belong to, but they are absolutely Indigenous, and they don't belong to a nation that is currently, uh, under the domain of the United States, right? Because many of their nations actually migrated back and forth up above the imposed border. Um, so I think that it's important to recognize for me that indigeneity in and of itself is indigeneity, right? That we don't decide for other people, right? We can decide based on actions, but not based on whether or not we just think that they are, right? Like, so if you have somebody who is light skinned, or is for all intents and purposes white, and they have an indigenous ancestor, maybe even a close indigenous ancestor, but they are not working for community, and they are, helping colonizers, then I don't think that that is indigenous. I think that that's where you can say, okay, that's not an indigenous person. Yet, if you have somebody who is light skinned, who has an indigenous ancestor, and maybe it's further back than the other person, and they're actually working for community, they're actually, doing their best within community to ensure that everybody is moving forward, and things like that, then that person to me is more indigenous. And that is my thought process. That is not everybody's thought process. And I don't expect other people to follow mine, but that is how I view it. And I also think, I know that this has actually been a real problem lately. I have seen a lot of people who are absolutely visibly indigenous to the Turtle Islands who are being told that they're not indigenous because their records show them as south of the border, without realizing, well, and we realize, like, people up north realize that that border was imposed, and yet still we seem to have this group that is like, well, if you're not connected to this nation or a nation, then you're not an indigenous person. And it's like, well, not all indigenous people are connected to current United States and Canada named nations, right? Like, there's a lot of indigenous groups that aren't connected there. At the same point, we see, and this is a huge example of cultural appropriation, where there is two groups in the eastern United States currently who are claiming to be, these are two groups of people who are claiming to be members of a specific tribe, of which the known descendants of are north of the Canadian border, um, and have no record of either of these groups being, descendants of any people. And the people who are claiming to be the leaders of these groups, when their genetics and their ancestry is done, there's some connection to a totally different indigenous tribe, but no an ancestral connection to a totally different indigenous tribe, but no ancestral connection to the tribe that they're claiming that they are. They're looking for federal recognition based on, right? So this is really an appropriation, right? Whether or not they have, a singular ancestor or a couple of ancestors from a different tribe or a different nation, when they're claiming that that their ancestors are from this nation, and they're trying to found an entire federally recognized government to grant, get me some land group based on ancestry that they don't actually have, right? Ancestry that they can't trace, right? And this is definitely an appropriation of culture. And this is definitely where we see people who are doing their best to gain money, to gain something out of this deal, right? So when we're looking at things like this, we are absolutely seeing the inappropriateness of this as being very much an appropriation of culture, right? Taking the name of something that's not yours, taking a history that doesn't belong to you, and seeking some form of return on it, some form of exploitation on it, right? That is definitely an appropriation of culture, right? And it doesn't matter that so funnily enough, it's two different groups, and I can't remember the name that they're trying to become, but or like they're trying to be federally recognized for. But funnily enough, the two leaders of the two different groups who are both trying to be recognized as the same, uh, not as the same tribal group, but as two different bands of the same nation, right? Um, are both related to the same ancestor from another nation, right? The other nation is Algonquin, right? So they both have an ancestor who is Algonquin, but they're trying to become, and the same ancestor that is Algonquin. In fact, one has that ancestor and another Algonquin ancestor, right? So this is definitely, instead of going to the culture that they belong to, becoming a member of the culture that they belong to, or, uplifting the culture that they actually belong to and being a part of an already there culture. They're trying to create their own culture based on their own ideas, right? And negate other people within this culture based on their own wants, needs, and to get a rebound, a recourse, an exploitation out of it, right? This is absolutely an evidence, or not evidence, example of, somebody who, even though they have indigenous ancestry, would definitely be a pretendian, right? Like that's that indigenous ancestry, but you're like trying to exploit, you're trying to take, and you're not trying to take yours anyways, you're trying to take somebody else's, right? So that's an absolute example of where you can absolutely have ancestry from a certain group of people and still not be, working in concert to uplift that group of people. And that's another space where it becomes really important to not only know and understand your own ancestry, and not only know and understand what that means, but to also, understand what it means to others. When we look at, there are so many people who are from south of the border that is, again, imposed, right? It's not a border that was here before. I've talked in here before about the fact that Proto-Dene is a language that stems from the southern tip of Mexico up into the Great Plains, and then starts in Northern California and goes up into Canada, Alaska area, right? That's Proto-Dene. And so we see that the Dene language really goes everywhere, right? And so when we look at that, that tells us that the Dene people are really crossing these borders all the time anyways, right? It's not like the Dene people are just in South America, right? It does not mean that all the people are not South America, South New Mexico. New Mexico, that's the word I was looking for. Or Arizona, in those southern states of the United States. We see that there are other nations under the umbrella of the Dene people that got caught south of that border, right? And the other nations under the umbrella of the Dene people are not claiming to be Dene, right? But they are claiming their indigeneity, right? And in many places, that language group has become other tribes, other nations that have sprung up and developed, that those people who are from south of that imposed border actually have connection to, right? If you talk to many people who are from South America, from Mexico, you will see that many people actually have a lot of a lot of national nation connection, tribal connection. I guess I'm going to use tribal because because we're talking about a different Westernfied nation on the overall, right? So you see that they have different tribal nations within their country or within their space that they are connected to, right? So trying to tell somebody what their own individual heritage is without having some knowledge is really screwed, right? And unless somebody is claiming your heritage, right, you really shouldn't be telling them, who they are. So if I were to say go into the Dakotas and claim to be Oglala Lakota, I grew up believing that that was what my grandfather was until I did my own testing and my own genetic tracking and everything else. That's what I was told. And my mother was actually told. by her grandmother, whose father it was, right? Who she hadn't seen since she was like 9. So uh, if I am to go, and I did, I thought I was a Oglala Lakota. I thought that's what my grandfather was. So if I'm to go into an Oglala Lakota space and say I'm Oglala Lakota, the Oglala Lakota have hello.
Hello, can I please speak to Sarah Morgan Oram?
This is
Hi, this is Fatima Safi. I'm a social worker calling from the Portland VA. Can I please have you verify your date of birth before we proceed?
3478.
Okay, thank you. So we have you on our case management program to be contacted twice a year. Do you recall speaking to one of our social workers about 6 months ago?
Um, no, maybe longer than than that. Can I set up this call for later? I'm in the middle of something and can't really talk right
Oh,
now.
sure. Yeah, when would be a better time to call you?
Can you call back this afternoon, maybe? And let me double check timeline. Maybe like 2 o'clock, 2:30.
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you. Uh-huh.
Sorry about that. Again, I have airplane mode and I'm still receiving calls. Um, so, and I'm not sure. I was somewhere. So when you look at a lot of people who are coming up from south of that imposed border, you have a lot of people who have connection to their ancestry and have connection to their nations and have connection to their heritage and their history, and are somehow being called pretendians because that connection doesn't come from nations north of the border. Sasheen Littlefeather is actually an example of this one. Sasheen Littlefeather actually claimed to belong to the wrong nation. She thought that she belonged to a local nation, and she actually she had Mexican ancestry. That Mexican ancestry was indigenous, but she wasn't a member of the local nation that she claimed to be a member of. So it's problematic that she claims to be a member of a local nation that she has no connection to. And at the same point, she's still indigenous because of the fact that she is a member of indigenous people. She has indigenous ancestry. Her ancestors have been here since before 1492, right? And has and was very recent, right? Her because they were Mexican ancestors, right? And so this is an example of where you get that. Most places call them reservations that I know of. Is anybody else calling reservations something other than reservations? Other than where you're at? Because most places that I know, well, okay, so Washington, Oregon, and the Dakotas call them. You're fine. You're fine. Washington, Oregon's, and Dakotas call them reservations, to my knowledge. I believe that Arizona and New Mexico call them reservations, to my knowledge. Um, Only because I haven't been told by people that they're called that differently. Yeah, here in Oregon, we call them reservations. Up north where I grew up, there were reservations. Um, Most places I know call them reservations. I've never heard of anybody else calling them colonies, and I'm like, or of anybody calling them colonies, and I'm like really actually weirded out by the idea of calling a reservation a colony, considering the fact that those are two different words with two very different opposite meanings, right? Like that is a very opposite meaning, right? A colony is placing somebody of your affiliation in another country that's not their affiliation, right? Whereas a reservation is you know, kind of pushing a person who's indigenous to a space into a smaller space that you can steal from them, right? So, or reserving a space for indigenous beings. And uh, verbalization about reserve and stuff like that. So it is the reserving of, right? And so it's really trippy to me. It's a really trippy, but a really trippy twist, right? A really trippy That's that sleight of hand. That's what I was looking for. Really trippy sleight of hand. Yeah, absolutely. I requested to follow, so you'll have to approve me. But yeah, I've never that's weird. And I believe you. I mean, in no way am I not believing on it, but I'm like, that's some sick twist of tongue, right? Like that's some sleight of hand in the English language they've got going on there, right? Like what in the actual, like who's buying it? Right? Like, well, and you know who's buying it. It's got to be the people who are, you know, that ultra red, like trying to like create that issue and that drama up high. Um, but still, it's just like, what in the actual, like that's just out of it to me. Um, but yeah, I think that that's one thing that I've noticed a lot of lately, and I've dealt with a lot, not dealt with myself, but watched a lot of my friends deal with it, like seen, and I've tried to address it, and I've tried to talk about it a little bit, though. I mean, that's not really what I do TikTok for. But uh, it's really becoming a problematic thing, right? We get that. It's not really in real life. Most people I know uh, might refer to people from Mexico as spicy natives, right? There's this understanding that the there's it's just a different colonizer, right? They're still colonized. It's still Spain colonizing. Spain's blonde haired and blue eyed for the most part, right? It's still a European nation conquering and colonizing an indigenous space, right? So it's like, how do you not see that as, indigenous people? Um, so I think that that's important. I think it is also important to recognize and understand that, you know, um, people have the right to, say you're not a part of this nation. There was nothing wrong with telling me, listen, you're not a Oglala Lakota, right? Listen, your grandfather was not Lakota. That's not who you are, um, because that helps me find my own path and my own knowledge, right? And also because, I mean, that's my how it affects me, right? But it's also important because of the fact that, or is appropriate and important because of the fact that people have the right to choose to curate, right? Who is a member of their group, right? People have the right to say no, you're not. And most groups actually have an understanding of who was there, and so are absolutely able to say with surety, no, we didn't have people by that name here, right? That's not a family name here, so that's not it, right? Or no, we can't trace that person or things like that. Uh, but to double down, you know, uh, you can be indigenous without being a member of a specific recognized nation. Uh, you just can't be a member of that nation, right? Like I wouldn't claim to be Red Paint Band Eastern Band or Red Paint Clan Eastern Band Cherokee. My great 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 grandmother may have been. That's the genetics that I show and the tracing that I have, but I still wouldn't claim it because she was claimed by, I was not claimed by, right? So that's another important distinction in that appropriation versus appreciation thought process. That when you have groups out there who are trying to claim that they're an entire not new tribe, but entire tribe who aren't, and are taking away from others who are, or we have people out there who are uh, pretendians or people out there who are wannabe aboriginals, and that's affecting Afro-Indigenous people or light-skinned Indigenous people, right? So I think that those things are important. Thank you. I like my gray streaks. My gray streaks are my favorite part of my hair. And it's getting quite long again. It probably won't grow past the middle of my back, though it never really does. So when we're looking at that, that's important. And it's important not just for us, not just for that reciprocity, not just for that understanding of doing better and being better, but it's important because of how it affects others. It's important because of the problems that it creates. Like we were talking about with the Afro-Indigenous issue, you know, to take somebody and decide that they must be, want to be Aboriginal instead of actually Afro-Indigenous because they look like they're Black instead of look like they're Indigenous is pretty ridiculous. Right? To heap hate on them for that, right? To tell somebody that they're not a part of a nation that they belong to. I mean, I've seen it where there are people that actually belong to nations who are being told, "Oh, you're not," and it's like, huh, I could show you my card. What do you mean I'm not? Like, so this is another space where appropriating culture becomes problematic, and another way in which appropriating culture becomes problematic that we have to not only be aware of, but ensure that we're not partaking in. Now, if you are appreciative of Turtle Island Indigenous culture and you know that you have no Turtle Island Indigenous history, but you really enjoy Turtle Island culture and you really want to, go to powwows and you really want to wear earrings, that's absolutely appreciation as long as you're not sitting here going, well, I'm Indigenous. My great great grandmother was a Cherokee princess, and so therefore I'm Indigenous, right? That's another way of appropriating culture versus appreciating culture, right? Yeah. Well, and I mean, for me, I think like, I don't know, watching the whole whatever his name is thing was really kind of hard for a lot of people, I thought. And it was really a little bit like insulting to me because, like, we're Indigenous people are very welcoming people, and that's something that we totally see. Um, and unfortunately, the pretendian issue out there has made it to where Indigenous people sometimes can seem more welcoming to somebody who is not trying to reconnect than they are to people who are trying to reconnect. And I saw a lot of people who were like, if I went to a powwow, I wouldn't be treated like that. Like nobody would do that for me at a powwow. And, I mean, I've never been treated rudely or anything else. Most powwows I've been to, everybody's known me anyways. But I still totally recognize that feel like, there's a level of acceptance there that isn't given to people who are reconnecting or things like that. And that is because of the pretendian issue that we have, right? That is because when we have accepted people as being what they say they are instead of going deeper sometimes, right? There's a band of Santa. Oof. Ooh, fun. That's a shit there. Yeah, down there right now too, and all that fucking heave ho, right? Yeah, that's horrid right there. I can't believe some of the shit we've got going on right now in our country. And I try really hard, like, to stay out of the political sphere because I know that getting in the middle of the political sphere is just another way for me to get banned in here, and I get banned so easily anyways that I don't want to add another layer to the ban layer. But the political sphere in our country right now is so weird. And the things that are political that aren't supposed to be political, that shouldn't be political, I'm not going to say that out loud just because. That's fucking epic, beautiful. I love you so much. That's the way to do that shit right there. That is absolutely the way to do that shit. Um, but yeah, the things that aren't political that are political. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'll take any questions that anybody has or any comments. We can shift discussion into other things as well. I wanted to make sure, though, that we had that discussion about what appropriation versus appreciation is. Kind of how to discuss with people how appropriation is impactful and why it matters to not appropriate culture. And, an understanding of things that, hopefully over the last few days, many people have learned about things that might have been considered appropriation that probably aren't appropriation, or things that might not have been considered appropriation that or they might not have been considered appropriation that are actually appropriation. So go ahead and open up to questions. I'm so blind and had eye issues in the last couple months that have made my blind kind of worse even. So like I'm trying to see things in a way that I can. Thank you, Leah. Is it Leah or Lee? Just so I can make sure. I do try and make sure that I'm doing it correctly. I have done a couple of lives on Indigenous issues, but I don't want to build my platform on Indigenous issues. And because I would rather uplift other people who are building their platform on Indigenous issues. And because I was asked by siblings to come into TikTok to teach how to find ancestry without appropriation for accomplices, not to address or speak to Indigenous communities, because that's not my space, to my feel. Thank you, Paisley. I appreciate that. Perfect. Thank you. But yeah, I think that it's very important as we're moving forward to really see quite a few of the things that, just the ways that we can be better in community. I feel like, community is such an important thing to who we are. And I don't have it, like I was saying earlier, like it's not really something I've ever really had, which kind of makes me think that maybe I can see the importance of it better than some people who, not all people who have been in it, because many people who have been in it their whole lives can absolutely see the importance of it, but better than some people who might be blinded to it because they've been in it their whole lives. But I feel that community is an extremely important thing. As we were talking like yesterday and the day before, and we have a few times, it's important to always touch on the fact that if you're trying to decolonize yourself, if you're trying to reconnect to an Indigenous community, any of these things, it's very important during that time to ensure that if you're European American, can absolutely decolonize your mind, but until you're helping the Indigenous communities around you decolonize, till you get people to understand that it's a reservation, not a colony. A colony was what Britain sent here, and part of the problem. If you're not actively involved in those things, then you're just decolonizing your mind. You're not decolonizing self. You're not decolonizing further. Oh, of course it's not. I will take a look though. That looks, I don't even understand. It's going to be interesting to see what their logic and their reasoning is. I'm always amazed by people's logic and reasoning for things. I always think people have to have a logic and a reason behind it too. And I guess sometimes they really don't. Sometimes people are like, yeah, there's no logic or reason behind this. It just is. But I can't wait to see what they think their reasoning is. I will be on through the end of the week, like last week. I'm trying to make sure that I come 4 to 5 days a week and come in. Yeah, if you're not standing up for things when you see it happen, your advocacy is flawed. Well, and a lot of times I miss questions like are being asked in the thing. And so I like to try and, open it up. Hey, right now is a really good time for people to ask questions. I know I have more of these. Did I ditch them when we moved? Sorry, as I'm talking to myself. Just because I want to make sure that people ask questions at a time when I can actually see the questions being asked as well, because sometimes I'm not paying attention just to keep myself on my go. Otherwise, I'll comment or reply to all of the comments, some of which probably don't even deserve my reply. Seem to have left all of my finer ones somewhere else. Okay. So I think that, it's really important for me to be able to see them, right? Oh, yeah, that's a real one. And to repeat it, it's very big to ask questions about whether or not somebody else is appropriating instead of just, assuming. Like, somebody says they're Afro-Indigenous, it's very important to not go directly to, oh, so you're at this. It's, what nation are you a part of? Or, Do you mean by that you're both African and Indigenous, or things like that before we jump the gun? If you see somebody wearing something that you believe is culturally appropriative, first find out whether or not they might be a member of that culture, right? Second, understand that some things that we think are cultural appropriation are not. Everybody can wear feathers. If you are in the United States, you cannot own feathers from a bird of prey unless you are a member of a nation. And I think even then you still have to have a special permit, right? So you can't wear, feathers that are eagle feathers, right? But everybody can wear feathers. Feathers is a global thing. Don't wear a war bonnet. A war bonnet is a purple heart. It is a sign of valor, and you are stealing valor, right? But if you see somebody with an eagle feather in their hair and they look white or they look black, instead of going, why are you stealing that eagle feather? Let me report you to the feds. You go, hey, are you Indigenous? Like, what nation are you a member of? Or, how did you earn your feather? Right? Because feathers are an earned thing, and especially an eagle feather is an earned thing in most cultures. And so, if you're asking questions, before you jump to the gun, and the thing is like, we jump to the gun based on assumptions, based on an exploitative thought process. We jump to the gun based on possession. We jump to the gun based on our perception of who owns things, right? And that's not really an Indigenous frame of mind, right? Most Indigenous, and that doesn't mean all Indigenous because nothing is monolithic, but most Indigenous frames of mind did not believe in, this ownership of things like that, right? um, Absolutely believing in being dishonest or made fun of, right? Absolutely being able to see those things, right? But automatically assuming that somebody is not something because they don't look like it isn't really something that you see in a lot of Indigenous nations, right? Prior to colonization, according to the way that elders teach us, right? There is a lot more of acceptance. Yeah, how'd you earn that feather? That's awesome. I see that you have an eagle feather. How did you earn it? You know, because most people really, I mean, everyone that I know, this does not mean it's everybody, but every North American culture that I know of, your eagle feather is because you've stood a line, because you're a warrior. You earn your eagle feather. You have done something for your people, right? That is not something that, I mean, it's not even something you earn because you're 14, right? Like, it's not even a rite of passage. It's an act of service for your people in one way or another, right? Most of it is absolutely frontlining or going to, like, being in the military, right? So it's absolutely important to, you know, um, ask people, hey, how'd you earn that? You know, because if somebody earned it, they'll know how they earned it, right? If it's something that they've earned, they'll know how they've earned it. And if it's not something that they've earned, then they shouldn't be wearing it. And then, I mean, most of the time at that point, they're not going to be Indigenous, but then you can go, oh, what nation do you belong to? You know, like, does your nation not believe in the need to earn turtle feather or earn turtle feathers? I know somebody named Turtle Feather. Actually, that's why that beautiful, beautiful young warrior. And that's actually why that came to mind. But how did you earn your feather, right? And oh, well, does your nation not believe that you need to earn your feather? What's your nation? Because my nation or the nations that I know state that this is an earned thing. It's a war thing, right? So what's your nation, right? So there are ways that you can find out if somebody is actually being appropriative or appreciative. Like, say you see somebody wearing earrings, right? Um, and you're like, well, maybe you believe that the wearing of the earrings in themselves is problematic, right? And so you're like, hey, why are you wearing those earrings? If they're like, I made them myself, they're Indigenous inspired, isn't this cool? Then you know that you're dealing with appropriation. If they're like, I bought them from this person, or this person gifted them to me, then you can know that they are more likely to have gotten them from an Indigenous person. And therefore, we're looking at appreciation versus appropriation, right? Just a few small, simple questions. And the same thing when it comes to pretendian or, the wannabe Aboriginal thought process. Instead of assuming somebody who is Afro Indigenous or somebody who is light skinned Indigenous must automatically be those things, if you're like, well, you know, what's your nation, or, oh, do you mean that you're both African and Indigenous? Or, are you Indigenous? Or, who's your grandmother? What's your protocol, right? Or, uh, so, oh, you're Indigenous to Mexico. Which group are you Indigenous to down there? Or, something along those lines. Just asking a couple different questions will really solve both you and that person from heartache, because attacking a person who is actually Indigenous, right? Because you perceive that they're not to your own eyes is not okay. It is also such a good way to learn, right? Because um, you know, say it's the eagle feather, right? Say, you see somebody walking around in an eagle feather and you haven't been a part of this conversation, so you may not know that, it's something that you can't have unless you're a member of the nation. And you see somebody with an eagle feather and you're like, oh, how did you earn your eagle feather? Or, how'd you get that eagle feather? And they're like, oh, I earned it because I did this. In my nation, you have to do this to earn that. And then they're like, you can't wear an eagle feather unless you belong to a nation, right? And so now you have learned, now you have gotten information about how that specific group is working, what the importance of it is within that specific group. And so you can carry forward with that knowledge, right? And now you have learned a new, maybe it's not your nation. And so, or, maybe you are Indigenous and it's not your nation. And so now you've learned a different nation's protocol on how to deal with eagle feathers, right? Maybe you're reconnecting and you don't know. And so when they're talking about it, you learn that eagle feathers, you have to have a permit to have, right? You have to belong to a nation to have and have a permit for, right? So um, now you've learned this information from that, right? Now you go forward with more stuff. Maybe they tell you, and they not only tell you that, but they've told you, I stood this front line and that's how I earned it. And then we had this ceremony that was like this. And now you garnered a lot of beautiful knowledge, right? Now you know not only that it's, something that's earned because of being a warrior, but you also know that this nation bestows them like this. And you also, have learned that you have to have the permitting and the rights to it. So you've learned all of this stuff all together, right? And it's just by asking one or two simple questions. Most people are more than willing to tell you information. If you ask somebody where they got their shoes, they're more likely to tell you where they got their shoes, right? Like if you're like, oh, those are really cool shoes, most people are going to go, oh, yeah, I got them at this store, right? So it's, you're absolutely with a simple question, usually going to get a lot of information, especially if you don't phrase it like an attack, right? Especially if you're not, what the fuck are you doing? Like you're absolutely going to get a lot more information, right? Um, So I think there's a lot of different importance in that, especially when we're moving forward as community, right? There's also the fact that like we are so many different nations, and it's true that many Turtle Island, North American, United States, and Canada nations actually know each other, right? That most of them know each other's mom and grandmother and can tell you, oh, you're a Cladisby, right? Or you're a Bone, or you're a Boom, right? Whereas many south of the border uh, nations might not have the tight knit documentation of that ancestry that you're going to see within the US and Canada. And that is because of the fact that in the spaces south of that imposed border, these nations oftentimes were more enveloped in. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of problem and a lot of racism, right? But what it does mean is that there was not a whole lot of trying to keep track of everybody being everybody because of the fact that they're you didn't have to, register. You didn't have to, you didn't, there wasn't a getting away from the reservation, right? There wasn't the reservation thought process that like tracks and numbers and documents everybody that we really had up here, and so you're going to see that whereas somebody from North America, or not North America, from north of the Mexican American imposed or Mexican US imposed border might not be able to tell you, or would be able to tell you, okay, so I'm a member of this space because of this grandsister, and this is my mother, and this is my family. Somebody from south of that border isn't going to be able to give you the same information because they don't, that's not how they track it, right? That's not how they work with it. And so accepting everybody to be able to give you the same protocol when we are colonized by very different entities is really problematic in the fact that you're going to call a lot of people pretendian who aren't, right? You're going to call a lot of people false who aren't actually false because of the fact that you are deciding indigeneity based on your group's perception of indigeneity when they're not claiming to be a part of your group, right? Um, and that's not to tell people again, how to dictate their parts of groups. Those things are all valid and important. It is to say that when we're distinguishing between things like pretendian or wannabe Aboriginal and people who are actually a part of culture and actually a part of, there are people south of the Mexican American border who, have participated in culture for ages and ages and ages because it was not taken in the same way. And so some of it was able to be maintained. I was talking or listening to somebody the other day, and they were talking about the fact that most of the language, most of the Spanish, Mexican Spanish that we have out there, most of the different regional Spanishes that we have out there from south of the border or from South America really are so populated with indigenous words that it's an entirely different Spanish from Spanish over in Spain, right? And so this again comes from the fact that the way of colonization of Spain's colonization versus the way, or different Spanish areas of colonization versus the way that the United States colonized and the way that Canada colonized really imposes different knowledges and understandings. When you read of what the Spanish conquistadors did, you see like a lot of them took indigenous women as wives. And their sons by those indigenous women were therefore inheriting the land through them, right? And because they took them as actual wives, we're looking at, lineages that, might be completely matrilineally indigenous, but completely patrilineally Spaniard, or at least in the early times, right? So it doesn't mean that they're less indigenous. It just means that there's a different way that their indigeneity is understood, traced, and worked within, which is completely appropriate. To expect anybody to be monolithic is mighty white, right? Like that's that Western thought process to expect that there's monolithic in humanity, monolithic in culture, monolithic in ethnicities. That's very true. Though I will tell you, like, so I lived with a man who was Swinomish and Upper Skagit when I was in my teens. I considered this man to be my first husband, um, a- and I lost a child that I was pregnant with him. So this man was Swinomish and Upper Skagit, and if you know coastal Indigenous, you know that Pacific Northwest coastal Indigenous, and actually like Dene, actually look a lot alike. It's usually very almost round faced, and then you get more of a almost flatter face, rounder and flatter. Whereas on the plains, you get more angular. Thank you. You get more angular features, like a stronger jawbone, maybe, like a more squarish face, maybe, or a more angular face, and you might get a bigger nose, right? Um, with that, he, being Upper Skagit and Swinomish, actually had, like, far back, they had like one German ancestor, and he was Upper Skagit and Swinomish, but he looked close, or he looked plains. Like he looked like he was from the Dakotas. Like he had very strong angular features. And what it was that the Germanic features of like his great, 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 great grandfather came through in nobody else in his family had these strong features. His dad doesn't have these strong features. Um, and he had these very strong plains features, right? But no plains indigeneity. Like his indigeneity was totally Upper Skagit and Swinomish. And it was just really cool to see how like that touch of German way back kind of gave that stronger feature. But when you see it mixed with the indigeneity, it totally looks like it's plains indigeneity, even though there was no plains indigeneity there. I had a picture of him that actually he looked like Lou Diamond Phillips almost. It was a pretty cool picture. His nose was much stronger than Lou Diamond Phillips, but he like um but yeah, you absolutely can see that different groups, even here in the church, like everybody's like, oh, the ethnicity. And it's like, well, yes, but that ethnicity has several different cultures underneath it. Some things have been cross cultural because of the fact that colonization has kind of moved a lot of people together where they might not have been together before, put people who are enemies on the same reservation, things like that, right? Whereas, so those things have kind of become translated as cross cultural or might go across culture, like the dream catcher being Ojibwe, but being used by many indigenous people, acceptably. But you can see still very unique features and very unique cultures in all of these spaces and regions. Oh, Lou, right. He had questions. Well, and that's another thing. Like, so we are learning that the alleles for skin color actually like they'll change in utero depending on the sun content of the mother, like where the mother's at in the world when she's pregnant. She might end up with a darker or lighter child, things like that. There's a lot about the alleles that are for skin color that we really don't understand or that we're just beginning to understand. um, it doesn't work like recessive genes does necessarily from what I've been made to understand about it. It works just slightly differently than like eye recessive genes work, but you still see that skin color will skip a generation or two and pop back out. Or you might have a bunch of kids who, like when in my early 20s, I had a friend who was very white, and her significant other that she had her first child with was very white, and their daughter was black, 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 you know. And he was like, what the fuck? And the DNA testing all proved, right? But still. Well, lineage and DNA is weird. It's funky and it's weird. And it does all these weird different things with it. And we end up having these assumptions that it's supposed to work a specific way, but that it's not how it works. Yeah. Well, and we know that a lot of people came over with the Holocaust, and when they came over with the Holocaust, that coming over with the Holocaust actually, many of those people ended up going into indigenous spaces because indigenous spaces could be very safe spaces for people suffering from the Holocaust, because most indigenous space, well, any indigenous space within the United States had already suffered from its own Holocaust. So there was, and was still suffering from its own Holocaust. So having German Jews come in was an understanding. Like they could go to some place where they were understood because they were dealing with people or moving into a space with people who had been through that. And so therefore understood what it was to go through that a lot more. I always find it amazing that we can see that, not only with the Holocaust and the German Jews, but we can also see this with with the Irish when they come over during the potato famine specifically, and with the Scottish when they come over in some spaces, not all the Scottish, but some of the later Scottish coming over. We see that they end up really becoming a part of, because of the fact that there is this this level of understanding of what people are going through, right? This level of understanding that this is harmful to people. I have weird little things all over the place, and these are kind of fucked up, and I don't know where the other ones are. My nails are all half wet. So when we're trying to, I think that's another thing that a lot of people don't really see and really focus on, is that so a lot of people don't understand that many people, like, there's this idea that Africa gave up Black people, that they let them go. Whereas in Africa, many people in Africa are like, no, that's not what happened. Like, we miss you. We wish you were home. Like, we didn't just give you up. Like, you were stolen from us too, right? Stolen people means stolen from us, right? And a lot of people seem to think that, seem to miss and forget that a lot of the reason that Turtle Island was able to be really conquered in the way it was that many people here were very welcoming and inviting and open, very, bring you in and take care of you, right? And so I think that when we're looking at those things, those are important to understand, that this this ownership idea, this ownership of things, can be very very problematic, in the sense that when you're looking at groups that didn't really look at it like that, you can't really get back to that if you are looking at it in a way that they might not have, right? And so I think that for me, that's one of those things that becomes really important in the understanding that, I try my best to, work in the way of my ancestors. I also try my best to see where, I could probably ensure that things that happened before aren't happening again, right? But to act in a completely antithetical to ancestral behavior way doesn't work for me personally either. Again, that doesn't mean we welcome everybody in. That I don't think that that's a positive either. I think that part of the vetting, or part of the issue, was that we didn't have that kind of a horror here, so that we could perceive that kind of a horror happening, right? Like, we didn't have some of the atrocities. And of course, again, nothing is monolithic. And so certain places probably did, or, certain places absolutely did. But for the most part, when we're looking at the specific places in early colonization, many of those places didn't have that level of atrocity. And so they couldn't see, when you're not evil, you don't see the evil in people, right? When you're not seeking to harm others, you don't see the seeking to harm others in people. And that's documented actually by the Europeans as they came over, as part of the reason that they thought that Turtle Island indigenous people were closer to God, because they had that, they called it naivety, but I personally look at it as compassion and love, and to me, it's that understanding of the purity of humanity. They hadn't seen. I mean, I'm not saying that they're pure completely because I think that that would be shitty to do as well, right? Nothing is monolithic and nothing is perfect, but not seeing that true evil that can be generated from things like believing in good versus evil and creating a good versus evil society. I think if we all had access to, I think all of them would have been, I think we'd be better off if our ancestors had access to therapy. The reason I think we'd be better off is if our ancestors had access to therapy is because I think that if they had access to therapy, they would have healed some of the damage that they ended up perpetuating on some of us. I think if my grandmother had access to therapy, then my mother would not have gone through the trauma that my mother went through. And if my mother had access to therapy, then I would not have gone through some of the trauma that I went through. Another one. Where did I have the other one? There it is. That's not work. Yes, Miranda. On my website, underneath tools is it's $300 for the cheapest one that I have found, but is a site that will do your whole genomic, and it's a recommended site by the Your True Ancestry site. As having that whole genomic. So it will give you the whole genome. It is the cheapest one I've seen. And when I saw it last, which was probably a year ago when I looked last, it was $300. So it is going to run you pretty high. Full genomic testing is extremely expensive. That's the start of them. Some of them run up to thousands of dollars. But you can absolutely start with that one. And I mean, it's as good as any of the other ones. So it's not like you need to go anywhere else once you get to that one. But it is, the whole genomic testing is really hard to find inexpensively. It's pretty expensive, it seems. Absolutely. What would I say the difference between a full genomic testing, which on that site, that's Nebula, a full genomic testing versus something like Ancestry. Ancestry only takes a percentage of your genome. So I think it's like 25% of your genome is what they actually look at. They don't actually look at the whole genome. And because they don't actually look at the whole genome, it's not possible for them to give you a complete and accurate thing. And then when they do that, they actually don't compare it to actual DNA. They compare it to groups of DNA. So say you have something that states that you are 23% Northwestern European. What they were comparing it to isn't Northwestern Europeans 1,000 years ago. What they're comparing it to is all of the Northwestern Europeans now. So that includes all the immigrants in that area. That includes everybody who is claimed to be Scandinavian. It doesn't mean everybody who is Scandinavian. It means everybody who's claimed to be Scandinavian. This is problematic, especially when we look at like indigenous DNA and stuff like that. And then it's just not giving you that full information. You can take that and go to like other sites and upload it and get more accurate information on what your genome is, or like what the actual groups of people are through ancient DNA or through different DNA tests, or not DNA tests, but like through connection to grave sites or things like that. It's still really though only 25% of your genome, so it's still going to miss things. It's still not going to be able to give you a full spectrum. Like with mine, I took it and it doesn't say anything. It actually says nothing about African ancestry on me on ancestry.com. My aunt, my mother's full sister, hers said on 23andMe says 23% Sudanese. Not 23% Sudanese. Sorry, the 23% is something else in my head. 3% Sudanese on hers, but it doesn't show it on mine. Now, this could be a couple of things. One, the way genetics pass down, I could have not gotten certain markers, right? The other is the way they've tested. She could have gotten 1%, one part of her genome tested, and I got a different part of my genome tested, right? And so you can see the issue within that. If I take my DNA to a different site, if I take it to Your True Ancestry, it says on Your True Ancestry, we see indigenous to Turtle Island. They say North American indigenous DNA, but we cannot trace it with this genomic testing. You need to get a full genomic testing for us to find it. We see that it's there, but we can't pull it out of this test itself. So if I take that same test over to your DNA portal, my DNA portal, on my DNA portal, it shows me exactly what nation within Turtle Island my grandmother came from, right? It shows me the Miwok DNA through my grandmother, right? And gives me a percentage and all that sort of stuff. But I had to take it to a test that could dig deep enough and analyze the markers in the right way, or take it to not a test, but to a place, a site that could analyze the markers in that way. So you're going to find that you're going to have spaces that will give you different information on those tests based on how those tests run about, and based on the tests themselves and the website itself that you're working with. I am going to go ahead and take off, my loves. I've got some appointment stuff that I've got to do this afternoon, and some other stuff to take care of before that. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of the live. I will be back tomorrow roughly the same time. Actually, I might try and go later tomorrow. All of those websites that I just mentioned for DNA are on my website underneath the tools portion of my website. So if you're looking for how to get that information, or if you have Ancestry DNA and you're trying to upload it to someplace to give you information, you can go over there and you can find all of that stuff on there. So I hope you guys have a wonderful afternoon. And again, I'll probably see you guys tomorrow. I might come in later tomorrow so that I can try and get like the second half of the day a little bit, because I know that there's different time frames that people are in. So if I'm not in the morning, then I will be in the afternoon US time. Put on this last thing and then I'll pop out. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much. It's just washed. Have a great one. Bye, everybody. Bye, YouTube.